This is Puzzlewood, a rare temperate rainforest within the Forest of Dean. I spent the day here, in the rain, trying to photograph small mushrooms and other tiny things. I began my walk looking at some of the fences along the footpath here, as they are all made from rotting real wood. And I very quickly found this tiny lacnum species of fungi growing on the fence. It was a bit of a challenge trying to set up the camera and tripod in a way to photograph these, and I eventually found something that worked, which involved photographing them upside down. So of course, once editing came along, I had to flip this photo the right way around. But I think it still worked out quite well, especially given the conditions and location of this species. Just a little further along, I found these two small white Mycena mushrooms. This was easier to photograph using my flexible tripod, like I often use for these shots. I then moved on to finding more mushrooms on the fence itself, starting with this single mushroom that was standing out from the rest, which allowed me to isolate it quite easily. I also noticed quite a few of them on the back of the fence here. They were a little bit difficult to photograph, and so I decided to try a few different shots and single out different ones to see what would work best. I first tried to focus on the small group in the middle here, and I was able to find a frame with the mushrooms in the front and back also in the scene out of focus that I thought looked really nice as it framed them nicely. I then moved my camera back a bit and focused on the one mushroom standing on its own in the foreground. On another fence post, I noticed this tiny white fruiting body. I'm not entirely sure what this was, to be honest. I was able to get a very detailed photo of it, but it's not something I've seen much before. As the habitat here is very damp all year round, moss thrives, so I decided to take a few close-up photos of different moss sporophytes that I could find as well. I first focused on this one standing on its own that was quite easy to isolate and focus on, as well as another one nearby that I forgot to film the background video of. And just to the side of that first find was a few more patches of moss that I felt made for really nice frames, and I was able to isolate a few more sporophytes, as well as this one that I focused really closely on just to capture that water droplet that was perfectly encapsulating it. Moving back to mushrooms, I found a few more Mycena species growing on some rotting wood. These were a lot larger than the earlier ones, which meant I could take a bit more of a detailed frame of them, and I was really pleased with how it turned out, getting the camera really low down and using a bit of the wood in the foreground to blur the base of the mushroom out. I also found some of these ink cap mushrooms. Unfortunately, they were a bit too early in their stage of growth to make for a good photo, but I did spot this group of 3 off to the side that were a bit more mature. It still wasn't a photo that I was extremely pleased with, but I still took it and it turned out quite nice for what I was given. I then moved to this area of moss-covered rock walls and other fence posts that I thought would house a few more different species of mushrooms, and it wasn't long before I found this fence post covered in more Mycena mushrooms. I focused on these two here as they stood out and were quite a nice level for the tripod to get close, and I was really pleased with how this photo turned out. Then moving on to what was probably the smallest mushroom of the day. There was a few of these tiny white mushrooms on the back of one of the fence posts, and after a lot of trial and error, I was able to focus on one of the smallest ones at the back and find a frame that I was really pleased with. And these mushrooms were covered in small droplets of water. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the camera quite as close as I wanted, but I was still really pleased with the final result. Picking up a few pieces of debris and wood, I was able to find this mushroom growing on a stick in the same area, and so I gently placed that stick on the fence post that I'd been photographing other mushrooms on earlier, and was able to find a photo that I was really happy with the mushroom leaning back to show the gills on the underside in detail. On that same fence post that I'd balanced that stick, there were quite a few other Mycena mushrooms growing alongside it. I found these three, with one in the foreground being quite far from the two in the back, but using focus stacking and taking a lot of photos, I was able to get all three of them in focus in the final shot. I then found another small stick with some really tiny mushrooms on it. I again balanced this on the fence post to allow me to get it at the right height to photograph with the tripod, and also allow me to rotate it and place it in a way to find a frame that I was happy with. I first photographed the smaller one on its own, which you can see here, and then photographed it alongside the larger one as well, just to show the scale of the two. After a bit more walking and trying new locations, I found another small white Mycena growing on this mossy log pile. This was a little bit different to the previous ones as it was really translucent and made for quite a nice photo. I then proceeded to find a few more ink caps like earlier, but again like earlier, they were a bit too immature to make for a photo that I was really pleased with. I did still manage to find a photo that I thought was decent, with the tripod sat really far back as I still had the 2x teleconverter on from the smaller finds earlier. At first I wasn't too pleased with this as the background was a bit cluttered, and so I came and carefully moved this small bit of plant matter out of the way, just to clear up the scene a bit. This is something I don't do too often, but in this example it was really worth it, and it doesn't cause any disturbance to move a stick or a leaf like that and place it nearby. As I came to the end of my short walk here, I came to another pile of mossy wood just to see if I could find anything else, and there was quite a few more of small white Mycena like I'd been finding throughout the day. I decided to focus on this one as it stood out a lot from the rest, and I was able to get a low angle looking up, which is always my favourite way of photographing these. And with that, my short walk here was done. It wasn't the most successful, mainly due to it being later in the season and the weather being quite harsh, but I'm still pleased with how it went. So if you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment, subscribe and stick around for more.